Okay, back for lesson 10. Let's talk a little bit about what happens between the occiput, between the skull, and the first two cervical vertebrae, known as A1 and A2, or the atlas and the axis, respectively. So we left off talking about the occiput and the sort of landmarks on the occiput that we marked in pink. So you'll recall those bean-like condyles on the occiput, on either side of the front of the foramen magnum, right? So they are matched. If these are the occipital condyles, they are matched in turn by a facet on either side, right and left, of the first cervical vertebra, known as the atlas. So the condyles sit on the facet joints, or on the facets of the atlas like this. And this is sort of an image I'll use with my students sometimes, because one of the common misconceptions about what happens at the top of the spine is that it's somehow a hinge joint situation. And it is not a hinge. It is a slidey, glidey situation that is really much more like this. So I don't know, sometimes the image of a rocking chair, but it's a rocking chair that doesn't just rock, that also glides, so that the head stays in the stays nestled in its little home at the top of the atlas. So Atlas, you think of Atlas, the guy who holds the world on his shoulders, right? So the atlas is up there at the very top of our spine. C1 is synonymous with atlas. And it's wide. It's wide. I will often, and I don't know if you can see this on your screen, but this is, maybe I'll walk a little closer, but this is the iPad. I think Nanette has this app. This is the one I use, but there's a bunch of them out there. But this is the a view from the front of the atlas. So I'll come a little closer. Don't know if that helps or not. Anyway, I think it's good sometimes to show students this because they can see how high up it is, yeah, right behind the nose. And they can also see, and I probably have him tilted a little bit. I think it's even a little higher. And they can also see how wide it is. So it's not like the top of our spine comes up and is this little spindly thing that our head is sort of bobbleheading on, right? It's actually quite wide. So that's cool to show people. And also on the app, if you you can see the articular surfaces really nicely because they're in white, and the atlas itself is in green. So you can see those bean-like facets on the top of the atlas to show you where it's meeting the skull. So take a look at that. I think that's what I want to say about the atlas. Is there anything else? The atlas, well, this is where nice transition into talking about C2. C2, otherwise known as the axis, right? Because C1, the atlas doesn't have a body. The rest of the vertebra have bodies. And C1 doesn't have a body, but what it does have is the dens of C2, which dens means tooth-like. Or it's called the dens. Another word for the dens is the odontoid process. Odontoid, tooth-like. So the dens comes up to essentially function as the missing body of C1, which is kind of cool. So I hope you've taken a look. I put up these are from Amy Matthews, and it's a nice list of the important landmarks of the occiput, C1, C2, the joints, and the ligaments of these structures. So hang on to this and color or draw in all the structures as you learn them. So this is a really great view of C1 and C2. Yeah, and you can see here how the C1, this is the dens of, this is the C2, this is the dens of C2, comes up to fill this sort of space in where the body of C1 of the atlas would be if it had a body. Yeah, so the DENS is not weight-bearing. Yeah, it is not weight-bearing, but the weight transfers again through facet joints on either side of C1 into C2. So you can look at how that happens. Oh, here in the side view, you can see that styloid process, that little toothpicky bone that we were talking about last time, nicely in that drawing. Where's a good view of the, I guess there's not a great view. Well, sort of in this one, which I've colored. This is this posterior view. You can see where C2 and C1 articulate with each other on either side. So you've got 2 points of contact, the condyles into the facet joints of C1, and then you've got the two facet joints coming from C1 to C2. From there, C3 has a disc, and we go down there. From there, the weight is being transferred through the discs. Or not the weight is being transferred for the disc, but we see discs appearing, and we don't have discs between C1 and C2. We just have the articular surfaces helping the bones relate to each other. So the other place that, I'll talk about ligaments in a second, but the other place, and you'll notice in your list that when we're talking about what's happening between C1 and C2, so between the skull, the occiput, and C1, we talk about that as the atlanto-occipital joint, right, where the atlas meets the occiput. And then the atlanto-axial joint is where the C1 meets C2, or the AA joint. So AO joint is skull to first vertebra. AA joint is first vertebra to second vertebra. At the AA joint, you have the right and left facets, just like you do between the skull and C1. And then you also have a medial synovial joint, which is where the DENS meets the front of the occiput. And I wish I had a better picture. Well, this is a good view. So now we're at the anterior and anterior and a superior view here. And you can see, I've drawn in a ligament here in green, but you can see this is a superior view, so looking down like a bird's eye view of C1, and how C2, the DENS of C2, is coming up. So it's really important that this little DENS doesn't travel any further back. This is the posterior direction. Doesn't travel any further back because it's going to get in the way of the spinal column coming down. So this space needs to be left nice and clear. So when the DENS comes up, it articulates. It has a little synovial joint between the DENS and the front of the occiput, and it has this ligament that that sort of helps contain it in the front of C1. So that ligament is called, if I get the language right, I don't know my ligaments very well. DENS to occiput, cruciate, DENS, atlas across DENS is the transverse ligament of the atlas. So the transverse ligament of the atlas goes on either side of the atlas around the DENS and kind of hugs it into the front of C1, so it doesn't get in the way of the spinal cord. So we have that, and then the DENS also attaches to the skull, to the occiput, by these other ligaments. So we've got, I think I put this up there, so you should be able to see these and then draw them in for yourself. So in red, I have the cruciate ligaments drawn in, cruciate cross shape. Yeah. And so you'll see that they go from the dens up into the occiput, and then also from the dens to either side of C1 to make the cruciate ligaments. And then the apical ligaments are in green, and there's one that goes straight up from the dens into the occiput, and then there's one that goes to the right and one that goes to the left. So it's really tethered in there. You don't have to worry about it floating around. But it's not weight bearing. So that connection of dens to skull is not weight bearing, but it is supremely directional. and I think there's a lot to be said about thinking of the dens orienting away from the tail and orienting up without it needing to weight bear. So I think of also because the tail doesn't weight bear, and we'll get into that when we talk about the tail. But the dens at the top and the tail at the bottom are two non-weight bearing structures that help orient the spine in either direction. So that's that. And let's see, is there anything else I want to say about that? How wide the atlas is, I said that, between the styloid processes. Yeah, I think that's good. So color in all of these drawings and get really familiar with those junctures because they're super important for what we do as Alexander people. And we will pick up and move down the spine when I see you next.